Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to my special guest, Senator Malcolm Roberts from Australia. I heard Malcolm Roberts' maiden speech when he joined the Australian Senate. That's right, isn't it? And it was a cracker. You talked about a lot of the things that I believe in, and a lot of the things I think our listeners believe in too. Stuff like freedom, low taxation, not believing in climate change bollocks. So welcome to the show, Malcolm Roberts.
Thank you, James. Pleasure to be here.
So should we talk first of all about something that's really puzzled me about Australia? And I think you're the perfect man for the job. Well, how come your coffee's so good? That's another one, but we'll come to that one maybe later on. What I want to know about Australia is there used to be an old stereotype of Australians as being tough, brawny guys with hats with corks dangling down from them, and they used to drink 4X because they didn't give up 4X for anything, and they budgie smugglers. They wrestled with saltwater crocodiles, Crocodile Dundee, all that stuff. Australia was the epitome of no-nonsense manliness. And now you are a bunch of violently left-wing panty-waists. What happened to you?
Well, I think we've found the political correctness again. It happened in New Zealand as well, but the New Zealanders still prepare the All Blacks.
Yes, that's true. They've got the All Blacks.
So they've still got that manliness. Australians have still got some of the outback stereotype, but largely political correctness has taken hold in Australia.
How did that happen?
It happened because the Greens developed a technique of smearing people. And remember, James, always they smear the one you fear. So they smeared people. And what happened was they took votes from the Labor Party, so the Labor Party shut up. And the Liberal Party could see they could lose some votes. And our Prime Minister right now, Malcolm Turnbull, comes from a seat that used to be marginal. And it used to be very strong in Green votes. It still is strong in Green votes. So the Prime Minister had to appeal to and pandy to the Greens. And so what happened was it meant the Greens could get away with saying anything and no one would oppose them. And what that meant was that everything just flies under the radar, and so everything is accepted. And that's the problem.
So the Greens are quite a serious party in Australia?
They were. They're on the decline. We can see that because for two reasons. First of all, their vote declined considerably in many states. Went up slightly in Queensland, but that's because so many people abandoned the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, and so many came to One Nation, and the few went to the Greens because they're tired of voting for LNP and Labor. So the Greens have gone up slightly in Queensland, but everywhere else they went down, and some they went down by quite a bit. They lost one senator in South Australia, which used to be their homeland state. They always had two senators there. They lost one. Tasmania, they just barely got the second one up. Victoria, they almost lost the second one as well. And I think the Greens now, especially with us actually calling them out and calling them for what they are, which is anti-human, anti-civilization, people are now realising they can actually say these things, and the Greens don't know how to come back. The Greens, all they can do, James, as you know, is all they can do is smear. Yeah. And when they start smearing so violently, then people just see behind the facade and they realise there's nothing there to these Greens people.
I don't want to blow smoke up your arse, Senator, but nevertheless, it seems to me that you're one of the very few people in Australian politics who's actually taking on the bastards. Because I've looked at your Liberal Party, which is in any other country would be called a Conservative Party, wouldn't it? I think.
Well, 20 years ago it would have been called a left-wing party.
Oh, really? Yeah, but for the sake of argument,
yeah, I know what you mean. They're like your Conservatives.
Yeah, exactly. They're supposed to be Conservatives.
That's right.
But the party is now led by Malcolm Turnbull, who is a lefty squish, isn't he? I mean,
yes.
He's very green.
He could have been in the Labor Party.
What? Yeah, why isn't he in the Labor Party?
I don't know. You'd need to ask him, but I'm guessing with his background, he appeals more to the traditional Liberal voters, which are supposed to be pro-business and so on. So he's a successful businessman.
Well, I thought he was Goldman Sachs.
Okay, so you're saying he's criminal?
Well,
is that what you're saying?
I'm saying he's a tentacle of the vampire squid, certainly.
Yeah, he's. I don't know him very well. He's very personable.
Yeah, smooth, easy, inoffensive, down to hell. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So
But he ousted Tony Abbott. I met Tony Abbott once when I came out to Oz, and I thought he was a likeable guy, a proper man's man. He likes to drink. He does that work with the fire brigade, doesn't he? And he seems decent. But somehow he completely screwed up as Prime Minister. What went wrong?
Well, it seemed to me that he was afraid of taking on the main issues, the carbon dioxide tax, the climate scam. There's no doubt he's a skeptic. And I've been told very recently, and all the way through to recent times, that he is a strong skeptic. And the people in the Liberal Party say there's no doubt about that. But of course he couldn't come out and say that. So what happened was he got basically the members of the Liberal Party and non-members to revolt. He didn't engineer it, but he saw that they were revolting against the carbon tax that Gillard put in. So he could see that needed to change. And then, lo and behold, as soon as he became leader of the opposition, he brought in direct action, and people felt abandoned. So right there, he was afraid to take on what he really believed, and you can see it in his voice. Now, I've been told by many people who know Tony Abbott closely, and that he's a really decent man, he's genuine. But unfortunately, his language used to give him away. You know, he'd have so many hesitations. You could tell he wasn't being himself. His voice wasn't down.
He wasn't authentic.
Exactly.
And
Thank you for that
we live
word.
in an age of authenticity, don't we? Look at Donald
Pauline
Trump.
Hanson.
Pauline Hanson. Yeah.
Nigel Farage.
Nigel Farage.
And who's the other guy in the...
Well, there's Boris Johnson. We've got...
there's another guy in your European Parliament from England.
Dan Hannan? No.
It might be that. This is an older man. He's been there quite a while. He's very impressive.
Roger Helmer? No.
I can't remember.
Anyway,
his name.
but
authenticity is very important. And you know, Pauline, when she does a Facebook post, it's done in one take, and people don't mind the natural imperfections because they can see it's not smooth, and so Tony Abbott didn't have that. And he was afraid of offending the media. He's afraid of taking on the media. And that showed so much. And then he ran away from the big issues. 18C he talked about strongly. As soon as he got into Parliament.
What's 18C? 18C
is the suppression of free speech. What is it called? Hatred, violence. If you use certain words, then they target you for being instilling hate or whatever it was.
Well, yeah, I mean...
what is it?
Didn't Andrew Bolt fall foul of something similar to do when he's talking about Aborigines or something like that?
He fell foul of Julia Gillard's chasing of him on that, and Andrew Bolt pulled his stance back quite a bit and was very quiet. He actually admitted to Larry Pickering in a blog that he was quite scared. And
if somebody like Andrew Bolt, who I consider a fighter, if somebody like him can retreat from the fight, that shows how scary the other side are. How the war on free speech is...
She had him going into court. And who knows where that could have gone with Andrew, So there is a lot of intimidation. So you wonder why we've become a bunch of pansies. It's because the government is now all-powerful. So Abbott resiled from that, and he recognises now that that's a mistake. Interestingly, he spoke recently in Brisbane at a Catholic presentation, and he is a Catholic conference, and he spoke very well. No notes, and then I heard recently that he spoke somewhere else for about an hour, James, and didn't have any notes and spoke very, very well, no hesitation. I think he's starting to become more his own man.
So your view on Tony Abbott is good man. He made the mistake of ducking a fight when he should have gone in hard.
Yes, I can't vouch for him being a good man. I can just tell you that people who know him say he's a good man. And also, I think that he was set up. You can see the way Obama approached the 2014 G20 conference in Brisbane.
Right.
It was set up. You could see that Abbott said there'd be no climate on the agenda, and Obama said there will be climate on the agenda. And then we had that staged agreement between China and America, in which case where China said, we're not going to do anything. How about that? That'd be great. And in 2030, we might think about doing something. Yeah. We might even think about doing nothing at all. And America said, basically, we'll sell away our manufacturing and destroy our country. There's our agreement. And the Chinese said, thank you very much. And that was staged as an agreement for the G20 to get climate on the agenda. Obama came out swinging and put climate on the agenda. He marshalled the troops. He made two disgraceful speeches in Australia. He basically canned the Prime Minister, which you don't do when you're visiting another country. Put a lot of pressure on. They were just greasing the skids for Abbott. And then Abbott was rolled in September of the following year. And unusually, when we can a Prime Minister, that's usually dead. But they continued to can him for a month afterwards, and it was pretty strong stuff. And you could see what they were trying to do was bury him forever, so he'd never rise.
So, what you're saying, I suppose, is that the global liberal elite, as embodied by people like Davos Man and President Obama, effectively conspired to help unseat a prime minister who was proving too conservative. Is that?
I would say that's true. And Abbott was always suspicious to them on climate. So,
Right.
He wasn't going full ahead.
Right.
And so what happened, very interestingly, a lot of Australians don't know this, but within a month of Abbott getting the flick, in October 2015, Greg Hunt passed the carbon dioxide tax through the lower house, and then on the last sitting day of the Senate last year, they got it through the Senate with the help of Labor Party and the Greens. So the Liberals used that. Now, Tony Abbott came to power with Greg Hunt standing beside him, making promises that they'd get rid of the carbon dioxide tax on Julia Gillard. So Abbott did that. But then as soon as he was flicked away, Greg Hunt put in place another carbon dioxide tax. And this thing has a carbon dioxide emission limit. I don't use that word emissions. Carbon dioxide output limit. It has if you go above that, then there are penalties. And if you go below it, then you get credits. So it quacks like a duck, waddles like a duck, and sounds and looks like a duck. It's a duck. It's a carbon dioxide tax. And the Liberals admit that a carbon dioxide emissions, a trading scheme, is a carbon tax, and they're right.
Right.
So we've got one.
Just remind me about Australia's economy. You don't have any natural resources, do you, in Australia? You don't have any coal or anything like that.
Second biggest export, as you know, cheeky bugger. And iron ore is the biggest export.
So maybe you can explain to me how it makes sense for an economy so dependent on fossil fuel to impose a tax on that.
Well, wash your mouth out. I never use the term fossil fuels. They're hydrocarbons,
right.
And they've liberated humanity. They've liberated the whales. They've liberated horses.
How have they liberated the whales?
Well, in 1826, it's very simple. In 1826, Sydney celebrated its first street lamp circuit. Street lamps, and they were powered by whale oil. And whale oil, as you know, was used for lighting in all over Europe and in civilized world those days. And wood was used for fuel. And if it hadn't been for coal and oil, we would now have no forests and no whales. But thankfully, thanks to coal and oil, we have now got whales, and we've now got 30% more timber, more forests in the developed continents than we had 100 years ago. So coal and oil are the best things for the environment. They're also the best things for developing prosperity, and then with prosperity comes a lower birth rate. So they're best things for controlling population, and it's all involuntary.
So when you say that coal is one of the best things for the environment, how does that go down well with the average liberal metropolitan Australian?
Well, some of them are starting to think. The Greens, of course, they dig their heels in and they start smearing me because they haven't got the facts to counter me, so they just smear me. And that's what the Greens do so well. But people are starting to see through that, James, and it's really liberating. We might lose our pansy status to you pretty soon.
I would be very happy with that.
You might see me in a pair of budgie smugglers in Parliament.
You do need to man up. So I want to know, before we move off Australian politics, what do you think of another revered Australian Conservative leader, and that's John Howard. I recently went to a talk given by John Howard, who was celebrated at a dinner in London. And I think a lot of people think of him as a really great Conservative leader. You're not so sure about that?
Oh, I'm absolutely sure he's not.
Oh, right.
Absolutely sure he's not. And just to give you my credentials, in 2007, when he was kicked out of office by the Kevin Rudd, the lies that basically Kevin Rudd told on climate, John Howard, I wrote him a letter because I was in a country museum and I could see the photos of all the prime ministers we've had, and I saw that Howard's policies and his beliefs had overseen Fraser, Hawke, Keating, and Howard. And so he was on top of the economics agenda for 30 years, James, which is quite remarkable. So Keating put in a lot of policies that Howard actually raised. So I wrote a letter to John Howard thanking him for his contribution. I mean, I don't normally write, but it was sad to see him go in that way. So I did that. In 2011, after I learned what he did on the climate scam, I wrote him another letter saying I rescind my letter. Because what the man did, when Kevin Rudd came waltzing down the street in 2007, he rode two things. He rode work choices, which Howard brought in, and would have been good, I think. It was so misrepresented by the unions. But the second thing it was that he rode the climate change bandwagon. He fabricated the climate scam. And Howard, instead of dismissing it, and you could tell from his body language and even his words that he was a skeptic, just like most of the prominent liberals at the time. They laughed at this stuff. But instead of ridiculing it and trashing it and calling it out, John Howard decided to jump on board. He didn't think he could stop the tsunami. And so John Howard, as the Liberal Party leader, became the first leader of a major party to put in place an emissions trading scheme, Liberal policy. And that was then kept on by Malcolm Turnbull when he overthrew Brendan Nelson. It was kept on by Brendan Nelson, for that matter. So the Liberals were the first to put in place an emissions trading scheme as part of their policy. But I think what Howard did, he said, let's have it in 2012. In 2007, that seemed an eternity away. He thought it'll all blow over by then. So that was one way of doing it. The second thing he did while he was in power, he brought in the renewable energy target, which was 20%. And that's been destroying our industries. It's raising the price of energy artificially. And as you know, energy is fundamental to competitiveness. And the third thing he did was he said, hand on heart, he said, we're not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. So that was welcomed. But he did say quite openly that we will comply with the Kyoto Protocol. And there are two ways of complying with that. You can either shut down any industries that produce carbon dioxide, or you can stop clearing land that would become a sink to carbon dioxide. And so what he did was he stole the property rights off the farmers. And what's more, two notoriously bad premiers of Queensland, Peter Beattie and Bob Carr, in New South Wales. When Bob Carr was Environment Minister, he made a video and he was laughing openly at stealing farmers' property rights with John Howard's help and for John Howard, because the reason is that John Howard couldn't steal these farmers' property rights by telling them they couldn't clear their land without giving them compensation under the federal constitution. But if the states steal their property rights, there's no compensation. So Howard actively went out and colluded, according to Bob Carr, and I've seen a letter from Peter Beattie saying that he colluded with John Howard to steal farmers' property rights. There's nothing more fundamental to a supposedly conservative prime minister than property rights, and he destroyed farmers' property rights.
Let's just explain to people who don't get it how he's stealing their property rights. It's because if you declare land a carbon sink with trees on it, and you forbid farmers from clearing the trees on their land, that effectively renders their land unproductive and worthless.
It's actually just the first step you got slightly wrong. They didn't declare them carbon sinks. Right. They said, let's just stop them from clearing the land because of native vegetation requirements, protecting native vegetation. And it's nonsense, and that was driven by the UN, which is bringing in place, it's got three legs to Agenda 21. You know what Agenda 21 is. I don't have to give you that.
Yeah, but tell the listeners.
Okay. In 1992, Maurice Strong led the development of, and the acceptance of, and the signing of 192 countries, or whatever it was in those days.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Rio Declaration for 21st Century Global Governance. And what they use three arms to this. The first one is biodiversity. So that means, James, that we've got to save the planet. We've got to put humans second to fungus and critters and bugs and plants. And, insane. I can see you shaking your head. And now you're smiling.
No, I was actually thinking I'm happy that fungus is being looked after because, I like mushrooms as much as the next man.
Oh, just stop washing your toes. That's
Thanks, mate.
Then the second thing is, so that then enables us, governments to steal land and stop development and control development, and that affects private property. And then the second thing, and it also controls industries. Agriculture controls fishing. So the Barrier Reef, we've now got, in one country, we've got 36% of the world's marine parks. 36%, over a third in this country. And so many areas of our prime fishing areas are controlled indirectly by UN regulations or directly by UN regulations. So when I say indirectly, these are passed by the federal government, or sometimes the federal government allocates money to the states subject to them passing regulations or to local councils passing regulations. So they've locked up our coastline. So we have a small population, 24 million, what's that, about a third of Britain's population, and we have the world's largest fishing zone in certain measurements, continental shelf terms, and certainly per capita we have by far the largest fishing zone in the world, yet we import 3/4 of the seafood we eat.
We'll continue this fish theme in the next section, and we'll talk about the Barrier Reef and maybe even some sharks.
Okay, face it. You love to binge. You know, on good stuff like cookies, spicy chips, TV shows, and of course, podcasts. Well, that's exactly why Thrilling Tales, the podcast, releases every chapter of its amazing stories on Mondays. So you can binge on the whole thing. So if you need something else to binge on or just something totally entertaining, get Thrilling Tales, the podcast now on the Podcast One app, iTunes, or at podcastone.com.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to my special guest, Senator Malcolm Roberts from Australia. He's going to talk to me about Australian things like white pointers, as I believe you call them, and box jellyfish, and brown snakes, and king browns, and salties.
We've got two types of white pointers. You're aware of that?
Have you?
Oh yeah, yeah. There's the white pointer shark, and there's naked breasts on a nudist beach. I don't know which one you favour.
And you've got how do you say it? Irukandjis?
Irukandji. Jellyfish. I think they're the same as box jellyfish.
Oh, no, I think they're different.
Are they?
Yeah,
they're
different.
Don't tell the people from Queensland I don't know that.
You live in Queensland. You live in Queensland, as you call it, rather than Queensland. Is that right?
Oh, I say Queensland.
Queensland, exactly. Yes, you do. And you live in Brisbane. And did you not recently go diving on the Barrier Reef to show the greenies, much to the world's surprise, that actually the Great Barrier Reef hasn't been wiped out by man's selfishness and greed?
And by the way, do you know how old the Barrier Reef is? They're telling us it's been here for millions of years.
What, you're going to say last week? I don't know. How
a little bit longer than last week, James. The northern parts of the Barrier Reef are about 8,000 years old.
Yeah.
8,000, that's it. In their current location, 8,000 years.
That's not very long, is it? No.
It's an eye blink, you know. And the southern parts of the Barrier Reef are about 6,000 years old. And so the sea levels rose after the last ice age. The sea levels rose about 120 metres. And that was only about 18,000 to 12,000 years ago. So the Great Barrier Reef hasn't been there long, and what that shows is it generates itself very quickly. So what we did was we became very concerned that the trashing of the Great Barrier Reef's reputation by these greenies, who are saying you can't develop a coal mine, you can't have industry, you can't basically do anything, you can't be a human without destroying this reef. So we've seen our tourist industry crash in certain areas. And so we went to Great Keppel Island, where a tourism boat operator told us that he normally has about 200 international tourists a day. He's now down to about 17.
No.
So that's less than 10%.
Is this sorry? This is because people are reading in the newspapers that the reef is being destroyed and it's not worth coming out.
Yep. And we know that that's complete nonsense. So, and by the way, in 2008 we had record cold temperatures in southern parts of Queensland, in northern parts of Queensland, and in Darwin. And the southern Barrier Reef bleached. And bleaching is a natural event. We keep being told it's something that's unusual, never happened before. It's happened in the last 100 years about 28 times. Parts of the reef are bleached. It's a natural response to either extreme cold or extreme warm.
So
just for a
I didn't
short
know
time.
that. Extreme cold does it as well.
Yep. The little algae, the coral gets upset with the temperature, boots out the algae, that's the symbiotic relationship, and they then grow again with another type of algae, so I believe. But the reef does come back. So we went, and remember, we've been told that the whole reef is dying. The whole reef is bleached, and it looks like skeletons. And so we went to Great Keppel, where we know the reef was strong, and we arrived there. And of course, some of the journalists said, "Well, we've got you, because the bleaching is 1,000 kilometres away." And we said, "Thank you very much. That means we've got 1,000 kilometres of reef all intact." Whoops, they didn't know what they'd said. And then we said, "By the way, we've come to see this reef, which had bleached 3 years before." So it just regenerates, and it's natural. And the thing that does the most damage to the reef is cyclones. It just tears the reef up. Of course, you'd expect that. But it regenerates very quickly. So the reef is under no threat at all. And by the way, ocean temperatures are declining. The empirical evidence shows that ocean temperatures are declining. And so it's complete nonsense what's been going on.
The environmentalists, it seems to me, have done an awful lot of damage in Australia. Well, you've just given an example of how they've damaged the tourist industry. But also, fishermen's livelihoods have been seriously damaged, haven't they? I mean, just go back a bit. I think even I can remember from school being taught about the World Wildlife Fund and how much they cared about saving the world. And I think a lot of people would listen to your statistic about how many marine reserves, what percentage of the world's marine reserves are in Australia, and they'd go, good, it's wonderful that the Ningaloo Reef and the Great Barrier Reef are being preserved for future generations. But can you maybe explain to people why actually it's not a good idea giving it over to the United Nations, Australian territory?
Well, the best people for protecting farmlands, for example, are farmers.
Why?
Why? Because they don't want to lose their soil. They don't want to waste excess money on pesticides. They don't want to waste excess money on fertilizers, which can pollute streams. So they're not interested in spending money to flush fertilizers and pesticides down streams. They want to use them on their land. And so the best person for protecting soil and protecting the creeks are the farmers themselves. And sure, the biggest things, James, I believe, the biggest threats to our environment are war, because no one has ever declared a war after an impact. They say, hang on a minute, before we invade you, we're going to have an environmental impact statement. They don't do that. They just invade.
They're not.
It's remarkable, isn't it?
Enlightened times.
No, not even remarkable enlightened Europeans. They just invade. So suddenly they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein or Gaddafi. They just invade the joint. But the second thing that I think is the biggest threat to the environment is poverty. Because what happens with poverty, if a man or a woman are scratching to feed their kids and wondering where their next meals come, they don't care that they're going to go and crap in the creek. And who can blame them? They're barely scratching out a living. And that's where the pollution comes from. And the third one is ignorance. And that's what the Greens are doing right now. They're creating an ignorant race of people, or an ignorant species of people in the West. Because people now think that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. Well, how the hell can it be a pollutant when it's in such a tiny proportion? But more importantly, it's essential for all life on this planet. It's natural, it's odorless, it's colourless, it's tasteless, and it's invisible. So it doesn't form pollution in any way. But more importantly than that even, its level in the atmosphere is controlled by the temperature of the oceans. And that's known fact according to Henry's law. So, and what it means, James, is that it doesn't matter how much carbon dioxide we produce, and this is significant not only for pollution, but also for climate change. It doesn't matter how much carbon dioxide we produce, the level in the atmosphere is determined by the temperature. And if you want evidence of that, you look at the overall trend in carbon dioxide. It's been increasing for quite a while now. But in 2009, we used less hydrocarbons, I won't call them fossil fuels, hydrocarbons in 2009 than we did in 2008. So there was a decline, a significant decline in the production of human carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere continued increasing. So
we've got to talk in a moment about you, because you just reminded me about your fracas on Q&A with Professor Brian Cox, no less. But before,
I'm glad you didn't call him a scientist.
But you were going to just explain about the fishermen, because why is it wrong for your wonderful reefs to be declared nature reserves?
Because the fishermen are the best people for controlling the renewable resource called fish. Because it's in their interest to not overfish. Because they have to maintain a breeding stock. And that's what we've seen. We've got a wonderful economist in our team, Darren Nelson. He will tell you that the best way to preserve animals is to make them private.
Yeah, no, I can see that.
Yeah, so it's the same with the fishing industry. The best people to protect the fishing industry are not the Greens having their cups of coffee in Brisbane and Melbourne and Canberra and Sydney, not the academics who sit on their ass dealing with theories, not the academics who are on the reef who are getting funded by grants and who have to say the right things that climate is changing and affecting the fish. Not any of them, because they've all got vested interests or ignorance. The best person is the fishermen, the tour operators, because it's in their interest to protect the coral reef and to protect the fish in there so that they can continue their businesses.
So where can your fishermen go? Do they have to travel a long way to go and fish?
Well, now some of our fishermen on Townsville and even Mackay, I believe, go. Your listeners won't know the map of Queensland. They travel about 1,200 kilometres up the coast and then round our Cape York and down into the Gulf of Carpentaria, which is probably another 1,000 kilometres. And they go for 5 months at a time. So it breaks up families, puts enormous pressure on people.
So they have to go over the top of that sticking out thing.
Yeah, that's the sticky out thing.
What was the sticking out thing called?
Cape York.
Cape York, okay. Well, that's a long way.
It's a hell of a long way. It takes them 5 days.
Whoa.
This is not just going down,
Because you'd think, wouldn't you, if I went to Australia on holiday, I'd be thinking, loads of fresh fish, caught in the seas just a few just maybe a mile or two from
fresh.
Townsville or Cairns or whatever, it would stand to reason.
Yep, and yet we sent our last seafood cannery packing in 2012 or 2012 I think it was. We sent it off to Thailand. Last seafood cannery. And you think of what that does. We don't have to mine the tin mines anymore for the tin for the cans. We don't have to have labels being made, printers, graphic artists. We don't have to have people making trawlers, servicing trawlers, repairing trawlers, people making fishing nets. We don't have the transport industries, and we don't have the fuel supplies being reduced. I was talking to some fishermen. They said around about 1,200 trawlers existed on the east coast of Queensland. And remember, we've got a hell of a coastline. It's a very long coastline. And now we've got about 280. Just three fell over last week in Cairns. They're gone. And Walter Stark is a marine biologist, lives in Townsville, which is right on the Barrier Reef, does a lot of very good work. And he said that he estimates the Barrier Reef fishing area can sustain a catch of 1,500 kilograms per square kilometre per year. And the actual catch is 0.9 of a kilogram. So what's that? 1/1600th. It's ridiculous.
It's quite interesting. What you're saying gels with what we're talking in Washington, D.C. at the moment, where we've both come to see what Donald Trump, President-elect, is going to do to the greeners, and I think it's going to be pretty biblical what he's going to he's going to do to them. But somebody was talking to me about last night about why it was that Trump became successful, and this person explained that previous conservative presidents, like the Bushes, for example, completely ignored people who dig stuff, who make stuff, who grow stuff. And you seem to me to be talking the same language that Donald Trump's talking. You actually care about people who fish, people who mine. Is this because you're a property millionaire and you have understanding of this, or what's your background, Senator?
Well, I graduated from university with an honours degree in engineering, mining engineering.
Oh,
and
you're
that's
a man's man.
So that meant that I understood atmospheric gases, including carbon dioxide, because we have to ventilate underground mines to keep people alive, So when I first started hearing about it, and then after graduating, I decided I better go and learn something. So I worked underground as a coal miner in 5 different mines, 5 different regions around Australia, because it's very important to have practical experience and people experience. And then I went to the States, and I worked for 2 large companies there, and got more experience. And then I travelled around all 50 states and all but one province in Canada. I couldn't find the bridge to Newfoundland, So someone forgot to tell me it's an island. But anyway, then I travelled a little bit into Mexico illegally, and that's how you do Mexico, isn't it? Illegally.
Yeah. Exactly. Well, they do it all the time the other way. So you've got an understanding of how what was it like, by the way, being a miner? Did you enjoy it?
I loved it. It's very interesting and that's what I loved it about managing coal mines later on as I got older, because there was very much an us versus them mentality in the underground coal sector. Industrial relations was abysmal. Management was usually very poor. Leadership was poor. But people have to work together in small groups in a quite isolated. They might be kilometres apart underground, just working in a small team of 6 to 10 people. And their survival depends upon how well they're working together. So there's that understanding. And so I loved playing football. I loved playing rugby union and rugby league. I love team sports. I love playing in teams. I love the teamwork. So underground coal mining really suited me. And then for the last 8 years, prior to that, I developed one of the largest underground coal mines ever built in Australia. We used a lot of innovative leadership techniques, and I was brought back from America especially for doing that. And that required a combination of leading people softly with teamwork, but also being firm industrially, because that was necessary in those days. And so I don't mind a fight. But I don't go looking for them, but I don't run away from one.
Have you ever been in a fight?
Oh, in the playground. But usually as an adult.
No.
I'm a little guy.
You are little, but you're a coal miner. I mean, you've got to be quite tough. But so, how is your party, the One Nation Party? If I were to read in a kind of in the Australian newspapers, I don't know, the Sydney Morning Herald.
You won't read about us.
What would be the Sydney Morning Herald's view? What's the Australian establishment view of the One Nation Party?
Let's see. The Liberal Party in federal parliament, when they saw 4 of us march in, didn't know what to make of us, because they heard about the rednecks and all the rest of it. And after a very short while, they came to realise they can deal with us because we tell the truth and we fight for what is good for Australia. Basically, you can sum up Pauline Hanson's One Nation Party by saying our role is to serve the people of each of our states and the people of Australia. That's the first role. To do that, we have to listen to the people. And so we actively go out and listen to them. And the third thing is we then speak out. And that's encapsulated by Pauline. And she asked me to join her in the Senate and Senate election because I have spoken out quite a few times in the past. And so what we do is we say what we think needs to be said. We're not afraid of saying things that will affect the Greens or the Liberal Party or Labor Party or upset people. And that is seen by some as anti-establishment because that's where we can see the damage.
So you're anti-establishment, but what would be the rude description of you? What would
some people would say redneck,
you?
bogans.
Redneck bogans.
Yeah.
Which I'm
ignorant, uninformed. That's the way the Sydney Morning Herald would present us as uninformed, ignorant, uncouth, and
so
uncivilized.
The people in the outback with redbacks in the dunny and corks on their hats, which I know you don't actually have. Have you ever seen anyone with corks on his hat?
I used to have them as a kid.
Did you?
They're very good for keeping flies off.
So they are genuinely a thing.
Yeah, well, they used to be.
And do people drink Castlemaine 4X in Australia, or is it not really a...
Yeah, but I think it's owned by a New Zealand company now, isn't it?
Right.
But anyway, yeah, we do.
So those people would love your party.
Absolutely love it because we tell the truth. And they see we're not pansies sitting down, running away from the real issues. We call a spade, and that's what's very refreshing for people.
Before we move on to your principles of democracy, which will be in the final section, I wanted to ask you about something. When I was in Australia, I went to far north Queensland, and I went to a place called Chillagoe. Do you know where that is? In the outback. Yeah. And I was driving for miles and miles across bloody nowhere, just scrub with gum trees everywhere and nothing else. And suddenly, in the middle of nowhere, you get a bloody police car trying to breathalyse you. I mean, the only damage you could do is to yourself in the middle of the outback. Why have you got this kind of police state in the Wild West?
Well, it's a funny thing, you know. You picked the one thing that I happen to disagree with you on. I like breathalyzers because they do kill people. Driving under the influence of alcohol is a known killer. But we have got police cameras everywhere, and they're not needed. We know that the data doesn't support the use of police radar because the data says the best way to set a speed limit is by removing the speed limit, letting the traffic run freely, getting the 85th percentile, and then setting the speed limit there if you have to. And of course, around schools and that kind of thing, you have a lower speed limit. But I agree with you on speed. That's ridiculous. The data doesn't back it up. But breathalyzers, I don't agree with you on.
Oh, right. Okay.
so I've got my budgie half covered.
You have to get your budgie smuggler moment, don't you? Okay, well, in the final section, we're going to talk about something that I found fascinating, where you outlined the key ingredients for a successful democracy.
Want to make some improvements in your life? Well, then check out Bulletproof Radio.
I'm Dave Asprey, founder of the Bulletproof Executive and creator of Bulletproof Coffee. Each week on Bulletproof Radio, you'll hear from thought leaders and visionaries from around the world to learn what it takes to live in a state of high performance, where you're in control of your own biology. Look better, feel better, be better.
Be one of the supercharged thousands improving their lives every week by downloading Bulletproof Radio at podcastone.com. Stay tuned for 60-second AP News headlines.
AP Update, I'm Diane Kepley. Questions are swirling in Washington about the contacts between Trump administration officials and the Russians.
Was General Flynn directed or authorized to do what he did? What was the extent of his conversations and contacts with Russia? Who else from the Trump administration, transition, or campaign had contact with the Russians?
Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer and others are calling for an independent investigation to get the answers to those questions. There is pushback from President Trump. This morning, he's lashing out at the news media, saying the fake news media is going crazy with what he calls their conspiracy theories and blind hatred. He adds in his tweet, the Russian connection nonsense is an attempt to cover up mistakes made in Hillary Clinton's losing campaign. Meantime, in Moscow, a Kremlin spokesman is denying reports about intercepted phone calls between intelligence officials and members of the Trump presidential campaign. AP Update.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
So, welcome back to my special guest, Senator Malcolm Roberts from the One Nation Party in Oz, a proper Australian.
I'm from Queensland. I represent Queensland, not One Nation.
Oh,
I just happen to be a member of One Nation.
Okay,
We've got to get out of democracy.
Queensland,
right, mate.
but okay. Most listeners outside Australia won't even heard of Queensland. I'm sorry.
What?
I'm sorry, mate. I'm sorry. I've been there, but lots of people haven't. You were telling us the other day about your principles for human progress, and I thought it's a very good list, and I think people are going to be nodding sagely when they hear you outline this list. So go on, fire away.
Okay. First thing is freedom, because their number one resource is not coal, it's not soil, it's not a barrier reef. The first resource that any country has is the human resource, and particularly our creativity and our initiative. And what happens, one of your fellow Englishmen, Matt Ridley, said it so well in The Rational Optimist. Ideas are sexy. But what he said was, it really intrigued me. What he said was the exchange of ideas is even sexier. Because I might come up with an idea, and you might say, hey, I can take that, and you'll embellish it and make it even better. And then Darren over here, he'll take it and blow it out of the water and make it even better. So that sharing of ideas, so we need to be free to think, free to share, and free to then take and create. And then we need to be free to use our initiative to create businesses. Let's face it, almost all the businesses we have today didn't exist just 100 years ago. So anyway, so that freedom is essential. And they're trying to smash freedom everywhere. The second thing is we have to have rule of law so that we can protect people and protect freedom. Because we don't want to live in a society that's ruled by the bullies, whether those bullies be economic bullies, physical bullies, or any other form of intimidation. So that rule of law is necessary to protect freedom. Then the third thing is constitutional governance. That gives us an ability then to have succession plans. And the Constitution is really our main legal framework. It's our number one law, if you like. And you understand this. I'm sure your leaders,
well,
your
we haven't
listeners
got a
do.
constitution in Britain.
You have effectively, haven't you?
Well, we don't have a sort of formal one. But yeah, I mean, I'm just quibbling slightly.
Yeah,
Carry on, right?
but you know which you're governed.
Yeah,
and you have succession.
We've got the English common law, for example.
Yeah.
And anyway.
So, and you have a succession planning. So you've got continuation of governance. So basically, instead of constitutional governance, you've got a governance of another form, but it's stable.
Yeah.
So it provides stability of the law. Then the fourth thing is secure property rights. So that when you use your ideas, the law will protect your property, whether that be intellectual property or physical property or the house you live in. So when you know that you can keep your house or keep your business, then you will invest in it and improve it. And so that's why farmers do that. So they improve their land, they protect their land. They don't want governments to come and steal it, because if that happens, then we go back to communist Russia where no one puts anything into their land. So then the fifth one is is honest money. And we don't have that at the moment. But honest money means currency that has a proper backing to it and that is not controlled by any one entity.
Yeah, no, actually,
I'll
pause you there, because one doesn't hear many politicians talking about sound money. I mean, it's basically you and Ron Paul, and who else? Because it's generally considered a bit of a Fruit Loops position, isn't it? Talking about gold standards and things like that, but.
That's the way they protect their position, by smearing us so that they give us a bad name to make us out as some kind of, they use the C word, conspiracy theorist. And the word conspiracy theorist is now used by the people trying to protect their position and smear others. I don't use the word conspiracy because none of this is a conspiracy. It's out in the open. Morris Strong talked about it. The major bankers talked about it. The Rockefellers. They all talked about it. And the Federal Reserve Bank has openly stated it's privately owned. So the Bank of England was privately owned when it was formed. It's now, I think in the 1940s, 46 or something, it was bailed out and is no longer privately owned. But it is privately controlled. The major central banks are privately controlled. I don't know about all central banks, but the majority in Europe are. So anyway, that is giving someone a monopoly over money, the fundamental financial resource. So that enables them to control economies. And the Federal Reserve Bank controls and what's the word? Castrates the American economy. So then the next one is fair, efficient, honest tax systems. And our tax systems now, James, are anything but fair. And in Australia, for example, we heard a Deputy Commissioner of Taxation, Jim Kalali, just in January this year, he said, in 1996 and 2010 he said this, and I confirmed it with him in January this year. He said that 90% of Australia's large companies are foreign-owned, and since 1953 have paid little or no company tax. And that cost us around about $100 billion in revenue. That is staggering. That's double our budget deficit. So we could pay off the budget deficit like that. We could pay off our debt in no time if we had a fair tax system. What happens with tax, as you know, when you levy a tax on something, you decrease its use. So we have taxes in our states on payroll. So we're trying to decrease payroll. Yeah. We're taxing employment, creating unemployment. In the federal government, we have an income tax that is based on gross income. So if a person wants to get a higher wage, take-home pay, then the employer has to pay on top of that enough so that they can pay a tax. And that is a disincentive to employment. With a simple change to, and as you know, a company these days, by changing its books, can fiddle the tax to be whatever you want it to be to minimise tax, but individuals can't do that. So what's happening is the vast majority of Australia's taxation comes from the middle class. And that's not fair, and it's destroying initiative in this country. If you look closely once you understand these figures, and you look closely at many of the things that are causing Australia so much damage, socially as well as economically, as well as industrially, right down at the bottom of it all is tax.
What is the tax rate in Australia?
It varies from depending upon people's income.
Yeah,
but
what's the top rate?
It's about 48%, I think.
No, that's right. That's crazy. That's socialist, that is.
Now, I might be wrong on that because I don't pay attention. I'm one of these politicians.
I don't pay tax.
No. I pay tax. Well, actually, I haven't paid a lot of tax for a while because I've been working voluntarily for 8 years on this climate scam, exposing that. And now, I mean it literally. I have been working pro bono, but I'll come back onto that. The seventh thing is families, because families are the fundamental unit for human existence, human society. And families used to be the fundamental unit for welfare, and it's the best place to have welfare. And then the last one is proven very strongly since the Industrial Revolution. You guys started the steam engine, and that is energy. Cheap, accessible, reliable, secure energy that is environmentally responsible. Now, if you look at each of those things, Jane, and the reason why energy is so important is that cheap energy maximizes productivity. When you have high productivity, you have development of prosperity. When you have prosperity, then you have freedom, you have development of sciences, you have development of protection for the environment, you have a lower birth rate, which reduces pressure on our natural resources, on our wildlands. So that cheap energy is absolutely essential, and every one of those single eight steps that I just pointed out, the keys to human progress: freedom, rule of law, constitutional governance, secure property rights, honest money, fair, efficient taxation, honest taxation, families, strong families, and cheap, affordable energy. Every one of those is being undermined by the Greens and the people on the left. I don't call them left versus right anymore, as you know. I call it control versus freedom. The people who are on the control side of politics, the control agenda, they're undermining every one of those, even though they've proven that lifted us out of the Stone Age, basically, out of the pre-industrial age into modern civilization. And so our kids don't know this, and we have to tell them that.
Yeah. So you've made explicit the connection between the environmentalist obsession with climate change and the war on...
Not the environmentalists, the control freaks.
The control freaks, yeah.
They're using the environmental movement and tarnishing the environmental movement. And I looked at this after about 5 years of working on climate. I said, why am I doing this? Because it's costing my family a lot of money. I'm foregoing considerable income. And so I looked at it and I thought, why am I doing this? I'm doing it, number one, for freedom, because that's what this has all been about. It's been about control of our resources, control of people's lifestyles, literally through Agenda 21, the UN pushing that, through our federal parliament. Secondly, I was doing it to restore scientific integrity, because science has given us our way of life. And scientific method gave us something else, gave us objectivity, which meant it ended the rule of the bully, whether that be a bully through economic terms or financial terms or physical bully. The third reason was on protecting the environment, because science and integrity are needed to protect the environment. And when you have cheap energy, you protect the environment because you develop prosperity, which enables us to afford to protect the environment. The fourth reason was I wanted to make sure that we have the economic security that we're entitled to. And the fifth one, this is might seem strange to some people, but it's a spiritual thing. It's I think there's a need to return people to connecting with their roots in nature. And right now, the people who are saying that we are affecting the climate, it's impossible, and the data shows we're not. The data contradicts that completely. But they're saying that we're affecting the climate. What, in fact, they're doing, James, is they're denying natural climate change. A farmer told me on Cape York last week, I was listening to him, he said, we have a nature deficit disorder. And I thought, here was this bushy with everything but the cork bobbing around his hat. He had the old bushy hat and a slow drawl, and he said, nature deficit disorder. And it's taking us away from nature. And the remarkable thing is that we used to be controlled by nature. You know, our droughts, our floods, our poor harvests, all of these things. We're now independent of that because of science and because of the modern economy. And these lunatics in the Greens are taking us back to those days because they're destroying understanding of nature. We now have carbon dioxide and natural gas being called a pollutant. Absolutely insane.
But I know that in the unlikely event that any Greens are listening to this show, they will simply point to an episode of the Australian panel debate programme, Q&A, and they will say, but Senator Malcolm Roberts, you were totally destroyed and humiliated by the great British professor Brian Cox, who wheeled out a chart. You remind us what happened on that show.
Do I look like I'm humiliated?
You look like you're completely destroyed, and I'm sure that's the version of the events that the Sydney Morning Herald and other newspapers would portray.
Well, as you remember, Brian Cox, who I call a celebrity academic, he might be good in his field.
He's got lovely lips, though, and a nice smile. And
beautiful hair.
Yeah, beautiful hair.
And he's not a bad bloke. He's a nice bloke to talk to. You know?
Is he?
Yeah, he is. Very engaging.
So did you talk to him beforehand?
Not much. I think he avoided coming in. But
you presumably weren't expecting him to wheel out any kind of any gotcha style.
Well,
chart.
he didn't wheel out any gotcha style thing.
No, well, I know he didn't. But tell us what happened.
Well, when he held up a graph showing an alarming temperature increase, what he said was alarming temperature increase. Of course, that was fabricated, and I pointed out two things right then and there in front of his eyes that indicated the graph was fabricated. I didn't mention the third thing, which was that the scale was probably exaggerated, which showed it was alarming, conveyed that it was alarming even when it's not. But it was a fabricated graph. And the really telling thing, James, is that this man said, this is even if the temperature was real on that graph, and it wasn't, but even if it was real, that's not proof we caused it. So the man is not showing cause and effect. He's not a scientist.
Just for those who haven't seen the show, it's a panel debate show, which is really quite very biased towards the left, it seems to me. I mean, your ABC, Australian Broadcasting Corporation, makes the BBC look like Fox News.
Australian Bullshit Corporation.
Yeah, exactly. So on this show, you're there as the kind of the token skeptic to be mocked and reviled and ridiculed, and then they've got this actual alleged scientist, Brian Cox, and he brings out this chart that he's been concealing in his pocket, and it shows global temperatures increasing dramatically. I mean, wasn't one of the problems, if I'd been in your shoes, one of the problems I would have had is I would have wanted to ask, well, where is this data coming from? Whose chart
he told
is
us
this?
It was NASA's data.
He told it, yes, but even then, I mean...
We're on to NASA, by the way. I can tell you more about that sometime.
You and I know that one of the problems with NASA and the various other temperature data sets is that they have been adjusting them to exaggerate 20th century global warming. But when you say that, you sound like a conspiracy theorist again.
Well, it's very interesting. What he did was he implicitly smeared me by saying, you probably don't even believe in the moon landing. You know, connecting me with something like that.
Oh, NASA, moon,
yeah.
Yep.
He said these people put men on the moon. Now, the funny thing is that the people who put men on the moon in NASA actually don't agree with NASA GIS, Goddard Institute of Space Studies. Okay, and that's the mob that's run by James Hansen, the activist, who was dismissed there, I understand, from what I was told recently, because he took some money from some, what do you call them, donations or grants.
Right.
And Gavin Schmidt, who's been tampering with the data. And these people have been making alarmingly incorrect statements. And it's very important to understand it's not NASA doing this, it's NASA's Goddard Institute of Space Studies, run by a handful of people. Something else, mate, I hate to tell you this, but you made a very wrong statement a minute ago. You said these data sets. There's only one data set. That's the Global Historical Climate Network data set. And that's been cooked up by various people. And so what we see then is we see this GHCN trotted out as NASA's data set, trotted out as NOAA's data set, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in America. So there's two.
Yeah, there's
and then there's HADCRUT from the Met Office, connected with the Met Office. And then there's some Japanese agency. People say, look, all four of them are showing this. But there's only one data set. And it's been shown to be corrupted in two ways. Number one, it's been very substandard. The United States network is by far the biggest and the best, and only 10% of it complies with the standards for measuring temperatures. And then we know that people, through ClimateGate activities, have actually manipulated the data to exaggerate the warming, and in some places to fabricate warming. We've seen the Bureau of Meteorology in Australia, which is part of this GHCN network. They have fabricated temperatures where none exist, no thermometers exist. Tony Heller, Steve Goddard, has documented a lot of this around the world. So it's deliberately corrupted, and it's also corrupted through poor work. So, and what we also know through McIntyre McKittrick, McKittrick statistician in Canada, is that when the temperatures weren't warming, what they did was they removed some of the colder temperatures. It's the stations with the colder temperatures, and that way gave a bias to higher temperatures. So we know that this is fabricated. So there's only one data set for ground-based, and we know it's completely corrupted. But NASA, GISS, Goddard Institute of Space Studies, won't use the satellite temperature records from NASA itself, which shows no warming for 20 years.
Is anyone else in Australia talking about this stuff? I mean, in politics? Or are you a lone voice?
No.
And what was the... Finally, what was the reaction you got after the programme? Do people sense that you knew what you were talking about?
Oh, very much so.
Yeah?
And they said, how come he was shaking when he was holding the graph up? And how come he had to throw it towards you?
We're talking about Cox.
Cox, I'm sorry, yeah. Whereas I was very calm. People said they loved my calmness because, James, I don't have to be upset because I know where the facts are coming from. It'll eventually emerge. Now, what Brian Cox did, he came up and talked to me afterwards, and I said, I'd like to send you some work. And he said, yeah, sure, send it to me. Haven't had a response. I said, if there's anything you can find wrong in this work, it's a summary. It's a very succinct summary. It was endorsed by Tim Ball. I asked him to review it, and he said, mate, it's 100% correct, apart from one spelling error on the bottom of page 3.
Well, you are Australian, I'm sure. So thank you very much. Thanks so much. We could have talked for hours, but that's been fascinating, and thank you very much. I hope to see you in Oz one day, mate.
Anytime.
All right.
My name is Anthony Ponce, and I used to be a reporter on NBC. But I got tired of being part of traditional news media, so I quit that job and became a Lyft driver. And now I interview whatever passengers end up in my backseat. So if you want to hear the best stories that real people tell me when we're driving around the city, check out my podcast. It's called Backseat Rider on podcastone.com, the Podcast One app, and